Richard Hale was the face of your neighborhood, the man who delivered packages and smiled politely at everyone he passed, but behind that calm exterior, he was a predator, a meticulous killer who hid in plain sight. For years, he haunted the streets of Grayridge, and tonight, for the first time, we uncover his darkest secrets and his last chilling words. The police investigation was relentless, yet progress was slow. Days turned into weeks, and every lead seemed to dissolve into dead ends. Detectives pored over records, interviewed dozens of people, and examined every possible clue. But the killer remained invisible, always one step ahead. The fear that had settled over Grayridge was more than just worry. It became a tangible presence, lurking behind closed doors and shadowed corners, a weight that pressed on every resident. No one could escape it. And the more the town searched for answers, the more the killer seemed to vanish into the very fabric of everyday life, blending into the crowd like a ghost among the living. The truth, horrifying as it was, became clear over time. The murderer was not an outsider. He did not strike randomly. He was someone the town knew, someone who moved among them, unnoticed, trusted, and even admired. His job as a delivery driver gave him an excuse to be everywhere at once, to observe without suspicion, to become part of the scenery while carefully plotting each move. He studied routines, memorized habits, and mapped the streets and houses with the precision of a man conducting a meticulous experiment. Each victim was chosen deliberately, each moment calculated, and yet no one suspected the quiet, ordinary man who smiled in the morning and nodded politely in passing. He did not act impulsively. Every crime was carefully choreographed, executed with a precision that frustrated the police and terrified the town. He watched his victims for weeks, noting their comings and goings, learning when doors were left unlocked, when houses were empty, and when the night offered him the cover he needed. In his mind, each act was a performance, a puzzle piece that fit neatly into a pattern no one else could see. To him, it was not about violence for its own sake. It was control, a dominion over fear, over life and death, over a community that believed itself safe. The residents of Grayridge began to notice subtle changes in their own behavior. Friends no longer walked alone at night, strangers' faces were studied with suspicion, and doors remained locked even in daylight. Fear had spread quietly but thoroughly, shaping the town into a place where normality was impossible. And all the while, the killer moved freely, observing the reactions he had created, enjoying the invisible web he had spun around the people who trusted him most. Even the investigators began to feel the strain. Weeks of dead ends, the constant pressure to protect the town, and the creeping awareness that the murderer was always ahead eroded their confidence. Every clue led to another question. Every pattern suggested another layer of planning they could not comprehend. The killer was not a man of chaos, but of calculated patience, a hunter who had perfected his craft and knew the limits of those who sought him. Grayridge itself had become his stage, and the police, no matter how determined, were playing a game in which he had written the rules. As days bled into nights, the town's unease hardened into dread. The killer's presence was like a shadow stretching over every street, every home, every family. No one could pinpoint him, yet everyone felt his gaze. He was the hunter in plain sight, a figure who existed in the quiet spaces between ordinary moments, invisible yet omnipresent. And Grayridge, once a town of trust and routine, had learned that the most dangerous monsters were often the ones who smiled back at you from the other side of the street. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, the kind of mistake that would change everything. One evening, a security camera at a local convenience store caught a fleeting glimpse of the killer's van parked near the home of a missing college student. The image was grainy, almost unremarkable at first glance, but investigators studied it relentlessly, tracing the vehicle's movements and cross-referencing delivery routes. Slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to align. What had once seemed like a random pattern of disappearances now revealed the hand of someone meticulous, someone who knew the town's rhythms in intimate detail. The focus of the investigation narrowed to a man named Richard Hale. On paper, he was unremarkable. A long-time delivery driver with no criminal record, known to neighbors for his punctuality and quiet demeanor. He was polite, helpful, and, most importantly, invisible in his ordinariness. Hale was exactly the kind of person no one would suspect, which made him perfect for what he was doing. The police quickly realized that the crimes had been carefully orchestrated, timed with precision, and carried out in a way that left little evidence behind. Each victim's disappearance had a logic that only someone deeply familiar with Grayridge could understand. When authorities obtained a warrant to search Hale's home and storage unit, what they found was far more chilling than anyone had anticipated. Hidden among stacks of ordinary boxes were personal items belonging to each victim, pieces of jewelry, clothing, photographs, and other small belongings meticulously labeled and cataloged. It was a trophy collection, a record of each life he had taken, preserved with care as if each murder were a badge of honor. The sight of it left the detectives reeling. They had not just caught a murderer, they had uncovered the mind of a predator who had been hiding in plain sight, carefully documenting every crime without a single slip for years. The town's reaction was swift and overwhelming. People could not comprehend that the man they waved to on the street, the one who delivered their packages without incident, had been capable of such horrors. Shock turned to disbelief, disbelief to fear, and fear to a simmering anger. Families who had once felt safe in their homes now struggled to trust anyone, even the people they had known for years. Hale's arrest shattered the illusion of security that Grayridge had relied upon for decades, and the psychological toll was almost as devastating as the crimes themselves. Even after Hale was taken into custody, investigators discovered that the full extent of his actions was still unknown. Some victims had never been reported missing. Some crimes had occurred years before the town even realized there was a killer. Each revelation seemed to push the edge of terror further into the community, showing that Hale had operated with precision, patience, and an unnerving understanding of human behavior. He had planned, executed, and hidden his crimes so effectively that no one, not neighbors, not police, not friends, had suspected his darkness until the very end. As Hale was led away in handcuffs, a strange calm seemed to settle over him. He made no attempt to resist, no hint of remorse crossed his face. There was an unsettling certainty in his eyes, as if he knew the story was not yet over, as if his actions were only the beginning of the revelations to come. Grayridge, though relieved that the immediate threat was gone, realized that the full horror of what had occurred, and the secrets Hale still carried, was far from complete. The town had survived the hunt, but the predator's mind lingered in the shadows, a chilling reminder that evil had once walked freely among them. Once behind bars, Richard Hale's demeanor shifted. In the courtroom, he had been calm, almost detached, but in the confines of his cell, he became something more unsettling, reflective, methodical, and eager to share the story only he could tell. He began writing letters, carefully penned pages filled with chilling details that went far beyond what investigators had already uncovered. Each letter was a window into a mind that viewed murder not as a crime, but as a carefully constructed ritual, a series of deliberate actions designed to satisfy a twisted sense of order and control. The letters revealed victims that no one had ever known were missing, crimes that stretched back years before Grayridge had even realized it was under siege. Hale described his planning with unnerving clarity. How he had chosen victims based on their routines, how he had observed them from afar, and how he had calculated the exact moment to strike. Every sentence carried a cold precision, a detachment that made the words almost clinical in their horror. To him, each act was an experiment in power, an exploration of fear, and a meticulous chronicle of life and death that only he could fully understand. Hale's writings also revealed a level of psychological manipulation that had previously gone unnoticed. He detailed how he had instilled doubt and paranoia into the town, how he had studied the effects of fear on families and friends, and how he had measured the ripple of panic that each disappearance caused. Grayridge had not merely been a location for his crimes, it had been part of the experiment itself, a living, breathing canvas on which he could paint his fear. In this light, the seemingly random terror that had gripped the town was no accident. It had been orchestrated with a meticulous understanding of human behavior, a disturbing insight into the ways ordinary people react when the world they trust is upended. The most chilling part of Hale's letters was not the recounting of his crimes, but the pride he took in them. He described the trophies he had kept, the careful labeling, the rituals he performed after each murder. Each entry was written with precision, as if he were cataloging a scientific discovery rather than recounting acts of unimaginable violence. He spoke of his victims with the same distance he had maintained during his life outside prison, seeing them as elements in a system only he could comprehend. The letters made it clear that Hale's compulsion was more than physical. It was intellectual, a game of control, observation, and documentation that had driven him for years. Investigators pored over his confessions, uncovering crimes they had never imagined. Some led to reopened cases, some to families who finally found closure, and others only deepened the sense of horror that had settled over Grayridge. Hale, despite being imprisoned, continued to exert influence over the town, shaping its perception of him, dictating which secrets would be revealed and which would remain unknown. In the quiet of his cell, he had become both storyteller and judge, revealing enough to terrify and withhold enough to ensure that Grayridge would never forget the predator who had once walked among them freely. As Richard Hale's health began to decline, he became increasingly focused on one final act, a confession that would leave Grayridge reeling. He requested pen and paper with the same precision he had once applied to his crimes, and over the course of several days, he wrote letters that were more revealing than any the town had yet seen. These writings were different from his earlier accounts. They carried a sense of finality, a deliberate shaping of his own legacy. Hale claimed that he had not acted entirely alone, that there was someone else, an accomplice, who had assisted him in choosing certain victims. The revelation shocked the investigators, who had long believed they fully understood the scope of his crimes. The idea of an unknown partner changed everything. Police reopened cold cases, scrutinized old evidence, and re-interviewed witnesses. Friends and neighbors were suddenly suspect, everyone a potential link in a chain of unsolved horrors. The town, still haunted by Hale's original crimes, now faced the terrifying possibility that the true extent of the darkness had yet to be uncovered. Hale, confined within the walls of prison, controlled the narrative even in his last days. He wrote with a calm authority, carefully revealing certain details while withholding the identity of the accomplice, leaving authorities, and the town, grappling with fear and uncertainty. Hale's final letters also reflected on his own mind, a window into the disturbing logic that had guided him for years. He described his murders as an art form, a series of orchestrated events in which he had studied his victims, his community, and even the investigators themselves. He admitted that some crimes had been committed simply to test his own limits, to see how close he could come to discovery before striking again. Each confession added layers to a narrative that was already chilling, demonstrating that his need for control and observation had not diminished with imprisonment. When the end finally came, Hale's final letter was concise, yet haunting. He claimed that the other person, the accomplice, walks free, and he left no further clues. Days later, he died quietly in his cell, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions, shattered families, and a town that could never feel fully safe again. The line he left behind became a symbol of enduring fear, a reminder that even the most thorough investigations could be incomplete when confronted with a mind as meticulous as Hale IDS. The residents of Grayridge struggled to comprehend whether the accomplice was real or a final psychological trick, a last manipulation from a man who had spent years perfecting terror. Even after his death, Hale's influence lingered. Police continued to investigate every lead, families continued to search for closure, and the town continued to live with the shadow he had cast over it. Grayridge had survived the immediate threat, but the knowledge that the predator's last words hinted at someone still among them left a permanent mark. The streets remained quiet, doors stayed locked, and ordinary life carried an undercurrent of unease. Hale's legacy was not just the lives he had taken, but the fear he had embedded into the very fabric of the community. In the end, his final confession ensured that the story of Richard Hale, the hunter in plain sight, the meticulous planner, the mind behind unimaginable horror, would haunt Grayridge forever.